Banish All Their Fears, Bayonet and Musket Volume 1. I wanted to do a video with my first impressions after having played through this because I think it is worth expounding upon a lot of my thoughts about this game. And that's not even counting where it fits in with other 18th century war games. I just want to take this on its own merits first, or demerits, as the case may be, and give you really my first initial reaction. This is not a review because I only played the one Battle of Blenheim, and I played it solo, so I haven't played it face-to-face. It was mostly to come to grips with the game's rules, which have a reputation online of being poorly written or deficient, and using the fixed counters from the 2024 GMT errata counter sheet. So with both of those things in hand, put it on the table and gave it a playthrough. So before we get into that, I feel like I need to address one thing, and that is I am really somewhat appalled at the level of support that this game gets from the designers and the developer. In some cases, the response to players is like outright hostile, if not like very derisive, and I just feel like there's no call for that when people are trying to come to terms and play your game and like learn it and you know, learn to enjoy it and play it correctly. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the only people who really know how to play this correctly are David Fox, Ben Hull, and the developer Mike Welker. Ben Hull and David Fox, from what I can tell from where my circles of the internet, have no desire or interest in interacting with the community, really. I have seen David Fox talk a little bit on Consim World with folks in the Bayonet and Muskets thread, mostly from an academic perspective around the history and the way the gameplay sort of manifests that history. He doesn't really answer any questions from players. Ben Hull is MIA when it comes to interacting with players. Maybe that's for the best. I don't know. But the developer, specifically Mike Welker, I've seen some stuff that I think is just like so toxic. The other day, as I was recording this playthrough, someone on BGG posted a question about battalion guns and how battalion guns function in combat, whether they're on offense or defense. And like the answer that was given to this person was just so like shitty and passive aggressive. And I just don't understand where this attitude comes from. Like, I get that there's a lot of people who like are confused about this, but at some point you have to realize that like the job of the designers and developers is to convey their model and message of the game to players to accurately play it properly. So I wanted to go over this example. Here's the rulebook. We'll talk about the rulebook in a second, but here's what the rules say on battalion guns. So as we know, get you a counter here. Battalion guns are these little embedded artillery units that can fire at range 1, and you flip them over and stick them on the unit that you're firing at when you attack, for, you know, if you're next to them, for example. Now, it causes an artillery hit. Now, if the unit that you're using the battalion gun on already has an artillery hit on it, and you add another one, you can't have two yellow artillery hits. So what the rules say is that battalion guns are a single-use unit. Each gun counter is stacked with and moves at no cost with an infantry unit of the brigade on the counter. It has an effective range of 1 hex. If the infantry unit attacks or is attacked from the front, the battalion guns may automatically be played prior to the resolution of the attack, flipping it over. Okay, we got that. Here's a clarification in the living rules. If battalion guns fire into a hex containing a yellow hit marker already, like this one is here, switch that marker to a red effective hit and end that combat immediately. So if these guys deployed these battalion guns here and there's already a yellow, you would flip this to red and the combat would be over. Now, the guy's question was, you know, obviously in defense, this makes sense. If you're being attacked and you use your battalion gun and there's already a yellow marker here, I'm going to flip this so you can see. This blue guy's attacking the white guy. The white guy's got some battalion guns on him. If there's already a yellow marker here, and this guy's attacking, when you are attacked, you can use your battalion gun, and then there's 2 yellow, and then you would switch this to a red. Now, the way the rules indicate is that when this happens, the combat immediately stops. Now, that makes sense if you're the defender, because you've put an artillery effective in the hex where the attack is coming from, which should stop the attack. But now let's imagine it's the other way. Let's imagine that it's this St. Paul, the white unit, attacking Montreux, the blue unit, and there's already one of these here. And during the attack with the battalion guns, you flip it over, and you drop it, and flip this to red. Well, by the wording of the rules and the way that it's written here, it says stop the combat. But that would be counterproductive because I'm trying to attack this unit and make him be under an artillery effective marker so he gets -2 to his combat value. So the person on BGG asked this question, like, surely the rules don't mean that the combat is over if you use a battalion gun on attack to do this. That would defeat the purpose of attacking, and you wouldn't want to do that. And that doesn't really make any sense. And the response from the developer was this really shitty, like, ooh, astounding logic there, as if, like, the guy is personally offending him about asking for clarification from the rules the developer wrote about how the battalion gun should function. And I just find that, like, super disappointing in general, because like, you have people engaged with your product who are trying to learn how to play it and play it correctly and want a clarification of an edge case that, according to the way the rules are written, is like, doesn't make any sense. So I just don't, I hope that, one of the things I hope is that GMT as the publisher takes a look at the way that the game and series is being represented for potential players by the developer and the design team, and like, hopefully rein them in a little bit to like, put a better face on the product. Like, ultimately, at the end of the day, GMT's name is on this game. They're the ones who published it. And I just feel like, do you really want some folks out there, like, being actively insulting to people? It feels to me like when the game came out and following sort of all of the questions, that they're really uninterested in talking to the player community, which I don't understand whatsoever. I feel like that's a great way to bury a series so that no more copies get made or no more people pre-order it. I know that on 2 separate occasions, I have asked specific edge case rules questions, politely for that matter, and not received a response. When the game first came out, I had questions about counters that didn't get seen at all, even though the developer was active in answering questions for other people. And I surfaced it multiple times, even asking him in other threads, hey, could you answer these questions I had? And then while I was filming this video, I had another series of edge case questions come up from the play that didn't get seen at BGG. I had to go over to Constant World and actually create an account on that godforsaken site to ask the developer. And then I got a bunch of non-answers to the questions I was answering. And I've seen that a lot too, where people ask questions and like the developer answers with like not even addressing what their question is and like with some non sequitur that doesn't make any sense. So I don't know who's running the ship for Bayonets and Musket, but I feel like it's the wrong people, is what I'm going to say. Now, I don't want to harp on that because that's not really directly relevant to the game itself, although it is a nice segue into the rule book. So as I said, I am using the Banish All Their Fears Living Rules, which are from July 2024. They are good. You can see the blue text is stuff that has been added afterwards based on people's questions and confusions. And there's not a ton of it, but I think the biggest problem was that the core rulebook actually shipped without like a complete entire section of the rulebook. Let me see if I can find it. That is a very important part of the game. This flank attack section, all this blue text, this is an incredibly pivotal part of the way that the game functions that just didn't ship in the core box. And what it basically means is that if you advance a front line of a wing past the support line of your friendly adjacent wing, you can then do a flank attack. So historically, and during the battle, you remember Holstein-Becks, Dutch and Swedes were over here, and they were on this way. Historically in the battle, they managed to get far enough forward to attack Oberglau from the side, something I probably should have done more, and that's enabled by this flank attack rule. That wasn't there in the core rulebook. There's a lot of stuff that was cleaned up or further explained, and this brings me to my biggest problem with the rulebook, is that I think it's actually very well written as you read it abstractly and try and conceptualize in your head. But as soon as you start putting pieces down and moving them around, you run into like these edge cases. And part of that's because the system is really novel and unique in terms of creating this rule set that's trying to simulate turn of the 18th century linear warfare. And so there's a lot of stuff that is not very, that you're not going to see in other hex and counter tactical games. You do not have a lot of freedom of maneuver in this system. You don't even have a lot of freedom of attack in this system. And once you put a brigade into certain orders, they're really constricted in terms of where they're going and who they're attacking. And so that brings up a whole host of things, because the system is new and novel in that way, where you get these edge cases where you're like, can I do that? Can I really do that? And the rules just don't really cover that. Now, the developer says a lot online, just read the rules literally as written. I read the rules literally as written, and there are still edge cases where I feel like the rules could have added a little bit of content to specify specific edge cases that come into play while you're playing the game. A rulebook does not have to be poorly written or confusedly written. It can actually be really well written, but it can also be confusing by omission. And I feel like this rulebook, there are certain parts of it that are confusing by omission because the people who proofed it and wrote it have a very clear concept of what they're trying to get across mechanically, but the language is ambiguous and leaves room for interpretation where there should be none. Because these interpretations are not specifically called out, in the rules, it leads to these gray areas where, well, the rules don't say I can't do that, but the implication of the mechanics is that this X, Y, and Z should be true, but the rules don't actually talk about X, Y, and Z. So you get a lot of situations where the rule book is not sufficient to clarify the things that that you're trying to figure out whether it means or not. And so while it is well written, and while it flows really well when you read it before you start playing, once you start playing, there's a lot of sections where there needed to be an additional line, an additional paragraph that specifically says, in situation A, XYZ is true. And in the rare case that situation B happens, XYZ is not true, or whatever it is. Now, I have volunteered to proofread Volume 2's rules if they're going to make any changes, or even to go through and provide suggestions where I think after playing this, there could be just a line added that clarifies some of the ambiguities around what the rules are talking about. But the team doesn't seem interested in that offer, so that's fine. It's your game. You can do what you want. I just know that in my game, and as we were proofing it, we read through it over and over and over again. And not only us read through it, but we had other people who were accustomed to not our style and not our comprehensive knowledge of the game to see if they could catch areas where there's something that's unclear or needs to be elaborated upon. And that number of proofs from people who have or are not close to the text really helped us to flush out and build a rule book that we hope is going to be comprehensively cover all awkward cases that might arise as situational things happen. And I think that needs to happen here. I volunteered to do it, but I hope that whoever is doing Volume 2 really takes a look at this rule book and looks at some of the areas that are still unclear to the player base. That said, it's well written. The clarifications are super helpful in the living rules. I didn't have too much trouble getting it up to speed. There are still some holes about stuff that I had to go online to ask about that were addressed online there's literally no way to tell what was intended based on the rules. So, for example, artillery units, as we see, are in the rules are talked about. They support the whole army. They don't have a presence on the brigade display over here. But then when you go to the scenario setups, the artillery are listed in a. Let's see if I can find one. The artillery are listed as in a specific wing in a specific line. And I had no idea if that meant that artillery are considered part of that line for the purposes of the relational brigade positioning. Like, can a support line unit, if this artillery is in front, can a support line unit move in front of it? My assumption was that no, because they're listed in the scenario setup as a specific wing and line. But according to the developer, that is not true. Artillery units don't occupy the brigade display, and therefore they do not count for being in brigade compliance when you're moving around. That would be impossible to tell from the rules and the way the playbook is set up. So it's just stuff like that I think need to be cleaned up. Now, that's probably enough to talking about the rules. It is perfectly playable as a game. You're going to probably have to come up with a few things here and there when you run into edge cases. But by and large, it's readable and it's mostly understandable. It's not a great reference, unfortunately. There's a bunch of stuff that's in different sections that I feel like should also be repeated. And that's another recommendation I would make. There are some rules that I think need to be repeated across sections just so you know where to find them. But if you're going to play with the living rules. Now, let's talk about the game itself, because I have a lot of thoughts about this as a historical model and as a game. So first of all, the game, Banish All Their Fears. What it's bringing new to the table. It is simulating battles that we typically don't get a lot of games on. And I'll do another video about this, about what space this occupies in sort of games about the Age of Enlightenment and the 18th century and so forth, because there's a lot to say there as well. But, how many games are we doing the battles of the War of the League of Augsburg, the 9 Years' War? We're not, which I think is great that this is tackling it. War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that I think deserves way more games on it because the history is so freaking interesting. And we're certainly not getting battle games about that. Compass has No Peace Without Spain, which is probably the most well-known. But that's a strategic level game. This is an actual tactical battle game about this period. And on top of that, it's aiming to really convey what about this period's warfare was so interesting. Part of that is the brigade display. I really, really like this. It basically forces you in your lines, in your wings and your lines, to organize your troops relative to each other on the battlefield so that you can never really get out of, do things that you wouldn't historically have been able to do as a commander in this era. the historical model here really focuses, and what I think the game's central thesis is leadership. Leadership is what allows you to kind of, what separates a good army from a bad army. And Ben Hull, one of the designers, has talked about this recently at a presentation he gave at Georgetown University. But like, you know, all things considered, most brigades were even with each other for the most part. And it really, what separated the winners and losers of this period was the quality of the leaders. And obviously Marlborough here, with a 3, has a very high leadership. The way that this leadership expresses across the battlefield is that you need leadership to do any kind of maneuvering. Maneuvering on its own is very, very difficult without good leadership. So as we look here, look at the target die rolls required for any of the sort of wing actions that you can take. And this is how you reposition your brigades so that you can move them more freely around the tactical map. 2, 1, 2, 3, 1. And these are all D10 rolls. So you're talking about a 10% chance, a 20% chance to do anything without a good leader. And so it's really the leadership here that brings the efficacy of the armies, the skill of the decision-making into play. You really need to look at the battlefield and you need to say, okay, 2 turns from now, next hour, where do I want to be focusing my attack? How do I get the units I need to focus that attack into position so that they can make that attack? And that all comes down to your leadership. Now, in this scenario in Blenheim, the French leadership is absolute crap. All of their commanders have a 0 for their leadership, so the French are at the whim of the dice way more than the Allies are. The Allies have Marlborough with a 3, which basically means, like, more often than not, you can, depending on where he is, you can accomplish what you want to accomplish with the units that he's commanding. You've also got his brother, Churchill, who's in here somewhere. You know, Württemberg's pretty good. Eugen is quite good as a 2. So there's a lot more flexibility on the Allied side, and that kind of brings to light how the Battle of Blenheim historically played out. Now, what's cool about the leadership thing as well is that depending on whether your leader is assigned to a specific brigade or assigned to a line in a wing, it changes kind of how under threat they are, whether they're going to die or rout, and who they can affect. If they're just commanding a line, they actually affect the entire line's units in terms of changing orders in position on the battlefield. If they're on a specific unit, they're only able to affect that unit, and they have a risk of dying in combat, about 10% chance. However, they do add their command value to the combat value of the unit, and that is huge. That is, as we saw in the gameplay, how I was able to kind of turn things around with Prince Eugen over here. His +2 came in huge handy, and the +3 from Marlborough with these brigades over here around the town were able to overcome some of these defenses. So the game is about leadership and the way that leadership affects the battlefield, and I think that is so good for this era. You're talking about very, very strict maneuver doctrine, very, very strict combat doctrine. Everything is straight up, and for the most part, everything is forward and back, forward and back, forward and back, in terms of like what you're focusing the unit's attention on, and everything is left to right, left to right, left to right in terms of how they can position. So in some ways, this game is really more of a positioning game than it is a true battle game, although the battle element is there. The other thing I really like is that the feel of that, of having to make sure that your brigades are complying with the orders that they're given and that they're staying in their linear formations like they would be trained to do in actual history, gives us a very strong historical verisimilitude, this game. I really did feel the challenges of what it would be like to command these early linear formations who have ditched pikes and are only just starting to use flintlock muskets, who are not really able to think for themselves. There's no unit initiative here. This is all command-based. But you have such a large army that's so densely packed in that it's like really just managing the way that your troops can be brought to bear against any specific part of the enemy's force. And I think it really gives a great sense of the history here. So I think that is I think the thing I like most about it, is that for once it truly felt like playing an early 18th century battle, because it's using rules and gameplay innovations that are not like any other tactical game. It'd be very easy to make this like a GBOH clone or even a musket and pike clone, and just add a little bit of chrome to it. But this actually really transforms the way that you view how the armies in the musket and pike era would behave versus the armies in this period and how they would behave. Now, the combat tables, there's only one, and the other thing I like about this game is that there's only one die roll per sort of thing you're doing. You don't need to roll, like in bar, for example, you're rolling tons and tons of dice for morale checks, and do you stand before you charge, and all that stuff. And while I do like that, and it does create a nice narrative, this game is pretty easy to resolve. There's 3 combat charts, basically. You've got infantry versus infantry, and you just count up the combat value of the 2 units to find what column you're on. There might be a couple modifiers based on if they're being flanked or not, or if there's a leader. And then if there's open flanks, and that's huge in this era, right? Because you had linear formations, and it was the units that had flanks open that were at the most vulnerable to the enemy because they could be enfiladed or outflanked by marches and stuff. And so having your flanks open is just a huge nasty penalty as we know about this period. So anyways, the combat table, really easy. The results are quite interesting. There's a wide spread. I did talk about the firefight result being a little demoralizing if you get a lot of them. The one thing I did want to call out here, and this reminds me of something like the Library of Napoleonic Battles, is there's some kind of asymmetries between the columns here that don't quite make a lot of thematic sense, and I'd be really curious to know why it was done this way. But for example, if you're at +3, which is the best odds you can get as the attacker, you can get defender eliminated twice. You get down to +2, and then you're at defender eliminated once and 2 defender retreats. And then you go to +1, and you lose your defender eliminated, way more common for a firefight, but then you go to +0, and whereas at +1, you could do both sides take a hit, defender retreats, then you've got defender retreats happens more often. So I'm curious what that's kind of like trying to express. Like if you're at even odds, it's less likely to cause casualties. I'm not sure, but there's like some weird idiosyncrasies between the columns that like make, sometimes it's like, well, I actually want to be attacking at +0 because I might have a higher, or +1 because I have a higher chance of causing a step loss. And ultimately step losses in this game are how you cause unit routes. I do want to talk about unit routing. I think that's a really nice feature. All of the brigades on the display correspond to the units. They have a morale value. As units are eliminated from those brigades, every time there's a rout, you make a check for the whole brigade, and you can suddenly just get whole brigades routing off the map because they failed a morale check, even though they only lost 1 battalion. And that really provides a lot of unpredictability to the way that the conflict is going to go. You can't just steamroll your opponent, because if you take a loss with like a really good unit, you're putting them at risk for routing. So I really like the unpredictability that adds, and I think it's one of the clever ways that this stops this game from being just like a really boring static dice rolling fest. Perhaps your units are going to break when you least need them to, or on the other hand, they're going to stand when you expected them not to, and we saw that with the French multiple times in the game. There's cavalry versus cavalry and cavalry versus infantry. I'll get into this more when I talk about this game in the context of 18th century games, but the cavalry-infantry interactions here are actually quite believable and much more nuanced than I've seen in other games about this era. I really like the way that's handled here. It provides an interesting puzzle for how you utilize your infantry and cavalry together, and by that, by proxy, that also affects the way that you use the orders to move brigades around on the battlefield. The other player aid is about the order changes. That's pretty good. The terrain effects chart. There's not a lot of terrain in this game, at least on this battle. The other battle doesn't have a lot either. And sort of what the different orders do and who you have to attack. And that's the other unique thing. When you attack, you have to attack hexes in a certain priority. You're not allowed to choose where your units attack. Your units are choosing where they attack. And that is a good reflection of the way that the units were trained in this period. What else do I want to talk about? The map, the components. Let's talk about those. I really do like the map. I think it's really well done. I really like the town of Unterglau being on fire here in this battle. That's really cool. I really do like the details on the map. I think the map art is quite nice, and we'll do a compare and contrast with Legion's battle game about Blenheim and the map art as well. The one thing I found interesting about this is that there's no elevation changes here. I know that on the far western side of the battle, these forests and stuff actually had a higher elevation based on other maps that I've seen over the rest of the battlefield, and that's not really reflected in the game. And I'm curious if they just did that to simplify the rules so you don't have to worry about attacking up and down. But this should have been a little bit higher, and maybe that's why fights in forests are a little bit harder, but this should have been a little bit higher than the terrain kind of coming down this way. I really, really like the size of the counters and the hexes. They went for a 9/16, I believe, size counter. It makes it really easy to handle. Stacking is pretty low, and it means that you're not bumping counters around. It feels like there's enough room for your fingers in here to manipulate the pieces. I think having a tactical game with big counters like this is a real great experience playing it. There's a lot of controversy about the pieces and the artwork on the pieces. As we see, it's kind of trying to simulate a top-down view of all of the soldiers. Similar to what we saw in Musket and Pike, although I think Musket and Pike does it a lot better. This game has some readability problems when it comes to, at least initially, when it comes to infantry and cavalry. So if I were to ask you which ones are infantry and which ones are cavalry in this picture, which ones would you be able to tell? You would almost not be able to. And I think while I do really like the overhead showing the lines of troops for the art, the one thing I don't like about it is that it's so small on the counter itself. I wish less room had been taken up by the words and the info in some fashion so that the art could have been expanded to make it a little more readable. By the way, these are cavalry. All the French here are cavalry. All of these are the white are infantry. And the only way you can tell is by the cavalry come in 3 ranks and 2 rows. The infantry come in however many ranks that is straight across. And that's not to be confused with dragoons, who look even different based on what their formation is. But yeah, the readability problems that people have reported online, I understand why they say that, because the counters are not the greatest looking. I think Musket and Pike did it better. I wish one of two things. One, you see how close I have to hold it so you can see an individual horse. One, I wish they had gone to a more stylistic approach like they did in Musket and Pike and made this illustration bigger on the counter and the other for information less large. And two, it strikes me as the design decision that would be made when this is really big on a computer screen and you can zoom in and you can see it. And then once it's printed on an actual counter size playing piece, it ends up just being kind of a blobby mess. So, your mileage may vary about the artistics of the game. I actually stopped seeing the blobs of troops as I played, and I really only saw the colors of the nationalities. That helped quite a bit. But the only way you can tell cavalry infantry is based on the diagram or the brigade markers over here. So that will come with familiarity, but it is a part of a learning curve is that you're fighting the visuals of the components of the game. I also really like the artillery system. Some people, I think, will find it... will have their issues with it, but I do like the way that artillery works. You get to fire your artillery first at the beginning of a turn. You flip it over, you target a hex, you roll, and based on your range, you'll get one of two or three results. You'll miss, you'll get an artillery hit result, which interdicts movement and combat value, or you'll get artillery effective, which is just a bigger effect to the artillery hitting. You don't actually cause casualties with the artillery, and that is by design, because the artillery in this period is not like the Napoleonic period 100 years later. The way that artillery was used in the scope of the artillery during battle was not that sort of like concentrated battery that causes tons of casualties. It was much more of a supportive role on the battlefield, and the real unit of engagement was infantry. And so really all it does is soften up target hexes. But what I think is interesting about this game is you can actually target empty hexes to sort of interdict movement against you. So if you think you're going to be charged, you can, put this down to make enemies move slower, or whatever. So it's a really nice system. Some people I don't think will maybe like that you can't do casualties, but I think it's appropriate for the history. And then let's talk about overall what I think about it. Obviously, I've only played the one battle, that's Blenheim. It was a learning game, and I learned a lot of valuable lessons about how to play this game better. And I would really like to play this game opposed, because I think the jockeying of positions here on the brigade display is what really is going to make the game sing when you're playing opposed. But as far as a game that is modeling the War of Spanish Succession and the 9 Years' War, turn of the 18th century, and the warfare and the way that soldiers moved and fought, I think this is a fantastic game system for that. I say that with one caveat, and I'll get to that in a moment. It handles almost everything you would need from that period in terms of giving you what the historical feel would have been from the commander's point of view. And I think that's important because a lot of tactical games sometimes it's pretty nebulous who you are playing as a player. In this game, you are making decisions at the command level, and the units are making decisions based on their training about all of the other stuff, where they walk, where they march, who they fire at, and all of that stuff. There is some decision-making in that, when you get to specific parts of a battle, but at least initially, you're just kind of clashing line against line. The one thing that's missing, in my opinion, and it's not necessarily missing, it's just abstracted. So Northern Europeans, especially the British, had a different fire doctrine than the French did. The French would fire by rank, meaning they would have the front or the rear rank of their columns of troops fire, then kneel down, then the next rank fire and kneel down, and so forth. The British and other Northern European nations, they fired by platoon, so they would divide their brigades into 4 quadrants, and then each of those quadrants would be further subdivided, and so they would fire in sort of quarters, basically, and they could keep up a steadier cadence of fire when they were getting into musket volleys with the opponents. And they were able to put out more lead than the French did in the same amount of time, essentially 3 times as much or almost 3 times as much. That is not really reflected here, that doctrinal difference, other than the British units tend to have a higher combat value. So it's an abstraction that doesn't quite work for me, but I understand how it sort of represents that effect on the battlefield. If you're fighting some French infantry and it's 4-2, this would represent basically the British having a much more effective fire doctrine than the French, or these are Bavarians or something. Much more effective fire doctrine just because their value is bigger. Where it falls apart for me is that casualties are also related to this number. So the more casualties you take, the lower your number goes. And so, well, at least the first time, then you put hit markers underneath. So it is there. It's just not quite it's not visible like it was in, let's say, the Via Victis Wars of Louis XIV system that we looked at, where it uses 2 different combat tables to reflect the difference in fire doctrine. We'll talk about that more in another video I'm going to do, but it's like a real nitpick. As someone who's really interested in the history of the tactics of this period, And it's definitely not going to detract from the overall game. So yeah, I guess my final thoughts here is I really, really, really like this. I'm really captivated by it. This sign of a good game is that when I'm playing it, I'm really engaged, and when I'm not playing it, I'm thinking about it. And it really wanted to get me back to the table to play Nirvinden, just to see how that battle is different. There's a lot going on here that's really novel, and I think really captures the history well. But the caveat I talked about, this is not a game for everyone. I think this series is going to find a niche audience with people who either want to try something new, or really love the history. I think those are the two people who this game is really going to appeal to. I really love the history, and I really, really want to see more games in this system, and I love that there's a Volume 2 on P500. I did decide to back that. That's going to include the Battle of Romilly, which I'm really interested. It's another of Marlborough's victories. But more than that, I think that there's an appreciation in the design of the history of the period. And I think the people who can kind of recognize that and understand it are going to get the most out of this. I think people who like tactical war games, they're going to find this difficult and maybe off-putting even. This is not Great Battles of History. All of the things that people understand and know when they play a tactical war game, like I'm going to, maneuver all of these units and they're going to go exactly where I want them to go, or I'm going to build up better odds against a specific part of your line. Those people, I think, are going to have a much more tepid response to this if they don't understand the way that warfare is fought here, because you can't do those things in this game. This is not a game of maneuver. This is a game of command decisions and positioning, and your troops are kind of out of your control once you've given the order. So that may be unsatisfying for some people who like to have sort of the full control of their actions and then sort of feel the repercussions of those actions in the battle immediately. That's not what you're going to get here. This is much more grindy than other games, and definitely feels like Musket and Pike, but it is not Musket and Pike. It is something completely different that uses some of the core tenets of Musket and Pike, but expresses a history that we don't get a lot of games on. So all that is to say, despite my problems with the rulebook, with the way that the community has been approached about the game online, and some of the component design choices, I think this is a really, really, really great system that I hope finds an audience. And if you are watching this, and if any of this sounds intriguing to you, or you're a fan of the War of Spanish Succession or the turn of the 18th century, you really should check this out, because you're going to get a very flavorful historical experience here, full of decisions that will mimic what the commanders of the time had to decide in terms of how their troops were going to approach a battle. It's not perfect, but I hope that, like other series that have stood the test of time, Musket and Pike, GBOH, other series, Men of Iron, that we can iron out, that they can iron out some of the difficulties in learning and onboarding with the game, and then they can get it really fine-tuned, and we get a lot of volumes in the series, because I think that there's a lot of potential here for some really interesting games about multiple topics and battles that we never see. And so I really loved this. I really loved my experience with this, and like I said, I can't wait to play Nirvinden, hopefully opposed against someone. I think that's an interesting situation. So that is my first impressions of Banish All Their Fears. If any of that changes significantly after I play this some more, I will come back and revisit it. But the next thing that I would like to do with this game, and you can tell that I really like it because I'm doing a ton of content on it. The next thing I'd like to do with this game is I would like to compare it to Legion War Games Blenheim 1704, the 7-hex system, and kind of compare and contrast the two games. I think despite what you're seeing here, what you may have seen about the 7-hex system, both of the games are far more similar than you would probably believe if you haven't played both of them. Visually, they look so different, but they're both achieving a lot of the same things, and they're going about it in two different ways, and I find that quite interesting. So that'll be the next video here. And then finally, we're going to put this, Banish All Their Fears, Bayonet and Musket, and Battles from the Age of Reason into contextual position with the rest of the games from the 18th century that I looked at the end of last year. And I'm going to kind of talk about those two systems in the three criteria that we used in that video to sort of assess those other games. If I remember off the top of my head, it was the role of cavalry on the battlefield, it was linear formations and maneuver, and it was fire doctrine, if I recall correctly. So we'll look at both bar and bayonets and muskets in that light and see how they compare to other games. So look for that coming soon. I hope you have enjoyed the playthrough, and I hope you've enjoyed this review. I tried to be as comprehensive and capture all of the thoughts that I had about this as possible. I look forward to Volume 2, Over the Hills and Far Away, which is going to include the battles of Steenkirk from the War of the League of Augsburg and the Battle of Romilly. I'll put a link to where that P500 page is at GMT's website in the description below.